Our next panel will be discussing international collaboration. Please welcome the moderators, President and CEO of the Canadian Air Traffic Controllers Association, Peter Duffey, and former COO of the ATO, David Grizzle with Dazzle Partners.
Good morning. So here we are at day 3 of CFS, and I'd like you to think about something for just a second. How many times have you heard the words collaboration or collaborative in the past 2 days of panels? I know I've heard it a lot. I knew this panel was coming up, so every time somebody said collaboration or collaborative, it struck a chord with me, and it struck enough chords, it's played literally an entire song. It would not be a stretch to change the name of this conference to Collaborating for Safety, because that's exactly what we're doing here. And it's become such a buzzword in our industry. Collaboration, you hear it all the time. It's a true buzzword, but it's not just that. It's a way of doing business, and it's a way of doing business that has been proved time and time again. We'll hear from some of our panel members internationally. It's still in its infancy in some places. Here in the US, where I'm from in Canada, it's in full swing, and it works. Think of all the panels over the last couple of days. Pilots, management, end users, industry, all up on the stage together, working for one common goal: safety. And think back about 10 years ago to inviting senior FAA people up here onto the stage. Would have been, ooh, bad. But it's changed. It's changed, folks. Collaboration works, and it's got a proven track record. But make no mistake, it's hard. It's a hard way to do business. And if times get tough, it gets even harder. David, you were one of the pioneers in the FAA about changing the way that the collaboration worked within your organization.
Yes.
I'm sure you got a lot of stories to tell.
Well, the fact is that everybody on this panel knows from hard and sometimes bitter experience that collaboration is essential if we are going to produce the safest and most efficient outcomes in air traffic control. But let's really be clear. Collaboration is not something that we do just because it sounds nice or because it will make people feel included. It is something we utilize, study, and practice because it produces the best results. And we are talking about collaboration not only between management and labor, but among labor and management and industry, and within and among each of those groups. But as Peter just said, collaboration is hard work. Collaboration is not something that you do just because you wake up one morning and decide that you're going to be collaborative. Collaboration requires tools and structures, and it also requires cultural prerequisites, which can take time to develop. And it requires the overcoming of bad habits. But it's worth it.
Absolutely. So let's bring our panel out. First, the chair of Prospect ATCOs branch in the United Kingdom and president of the Global Air Traffic Controllers Alliance, Mr. Paul Winstanley.
And next, let's get you your just applause there.
Okay. Yeah, it's ripple.
And next, AC Director from New Zealand Airline Pilots Association, Kelvin Vercoe.
Okay. From my home company, NAVCANADA, the Executive Vice President of Service Delivery, Mr. Rudy Kellar.
And Chief Technology Officer and Vice President of Engineering at Aireon, Vincent, or Vinny, Capezzuto.
Executive Technical Director of Raytheon, Rachel Jackson.
And finally, Senior Vice President in Leidos and someone who goes a long ways back with me, Fran Hill.
So Paul, I'll start it out with you. We've had a lot of discussions over the years about collaboration between unions and management, but what about collaboration between the end users and industry? How has NATS rolled out new technology, brought it in, and have you seen the pluses or the minuses about the controllers, the front-end users of these new technologies that are being rolled out daily, and how that pans out at the end of the day?
Okay, thanks, Pete. We don't call it collaborative working, we call it working together. We've had that in place now for some 15, 20 years. It was something that brought on by individuals who wanted to make a change, and in the industrial climate that we work in, it works pretty well. We even measure each other against it, so the NATS board can measure me against behaviours just as they can measure members of my exec, and likewise we can do the same. So it works really well in the industrial climate. That's not to say we've not had bumps along the way. Privatisation, obviously, the liberalised and commercialised tower market you have to work in causes us to have a few bumps. But like any relationship, it's something you have to work on. It is about personalities, and it's kind of four core values for me. It's about true partnership and treating each other as a stakeholder in the industry. It's about cooperation. It's definitely about respect. And the easiest word to say, but perhaps the most difficult one to achieve, is about trust. And in the industrial environment, we have to work hard at that. In the technical environment, things have changed dramatically. We invest a lot in new kit. We've invested in our own kit and developed our own kit for the ops rooms. But the best example I can give actually is with NAVCANADA and putting exceeds into the TC operation. We learned from all the mistakes we've made in the past. We engaged with controllers straight away. We put the system into the ops room and allowed controllers to play with the system before it went live and during their training, so you could monitor live traffic and interact with the strips, obviously not connected to the operation. I even did it with myself to make sure I could have a proper conversation, because as you know, I'm a bit technically challenged. But no, we've worked really hard at it, and it's something that on a global basis, I think we need to keep working on. It's one of the founding reasons why we formed the Alliance, that we believe there is a gap. There's a gap in our collaboration with industry. And you saw yesterday that whether it be drones, remote towers, digital towers, or space, or satellite ADSB, these are no longer national issues, they're international issues. Absolutely. And that's why we should be collaborating.
Let me remind everybody that we are using the questioning apparatus, and so be sure to put your questions in. Peter and I will be watching them as they come up. Vinny and Fran, you and I worked together starting in the bad old times, and we've still got our scars to show for it. But we also stayed around long enough to be able to see the benefits of our learning how to do things correctly. Paul just used the word trust in his remarks, and there's nothing more intrinsically cultural than trust. Can you guys talk a little bit about how the culture was bad at the FAA and how it became good and what contributed to that cultural change? Why don't we start with you, Vinny, but we want to hear from Fran as well.
Sure, absolutely. First, Paul and Trish, thank you very much for inviting me. I want to report that I did watch David Grizzle and Peter collaborate on who is going to be stage left and stage right. And it starts at that level because if you pay attention to the details, right, the rest follows. We use the dark ages, the dark days, the bad days. It really is interesting because the contract stated to collaborate. The article was there. There was an MOU in place, and in the case we're talking about is ERAM. It just wasn't really being exercised. And you saw Giulio stand up yesterday and get an award. He was the the thrust for NAVCANADA that allowed us to move forward and kind of rebound on a particularly large program. And it started by having communications. And communications means you have to listen, it's not you have to talk, right? And it's active listening, and it's understanding, and you have to understand what people are motivated by. And if you don't do that, you are talking past each other. And I think a lot of that was going on. And you know, from my perspective, I was representing management, program management, engineering. You know, the user, Julio was representing the user and a large contingency of people that were struggling with a system that wasn't performing the way it ought to have performed. And then the supplier wants to succeed. And you know, I go back to saying that it was the climate of leadership that kind of endorsed, you know, exercising what was in the contract already, and to push it forward. And leadership kind of set the tone, right? And once that happened, I feel like, you know, everyone got on board. You know, we were having very direct conversations with the supplier on what the issues were, and there was no more head in the sand denial. It was just everyone just kind of rolled up their sleeves and got busy. And I like that you say you can see it now, even though you have the scars. ERAM is kind of like the shining star in the NAS, right? And it was not in 2011, right? So, you know, that's my memory of what happened.
Fran, what's your perspective as coming from a major contractor?
Well, major contractor, and my background, I'm an engineer, so I am definitely not a controller, and because of that, as we look at the phases of development, you know, system engineering, software, test, you know, we need to collaborate in order to get it right. And of all the systems, for there to be a drought, let me call it, in collaboration prior to, I think, you know, ERAM had to be the worst, because we were going from that old host system to a system that, at least under the covers, was trajectory based. And so when you looked at a DSR display and an ERAM situation display, it wasn't like you immediately saw this drastically different CAI. And I think that's where computer-human interface, and that's where I think we were lulled, let's just say, into a false sense of this is gonna go great, right? The only thing we did is different in the CAI is the toolbar, and we did have collaboration on that early days. It was one of the very little things that we did do. And I will say that looking back on it, I was chatting around with some folks, we didn't ever get any changes on that toolbar either. So if we had collaborated early on ERAM, I think it would have gone very much differently. But I will say, you know, if you ask, if I were to ask you all, and many of you all are making our programs a success today, so let me say thank you for that, and thank you again for Paul and Trish for having me on this panel, because there's a little bit of an aspect of, we got the band back together again with David here, who was a partner in this, and Vinny, and then getting to see Julio and Bev again, and congratulate him for his award. We can't be successful in industry with our focus on system engineering, software, and test without working hand in hand in all phases of the program. So, you know, those of you all who work with us, you work with us in setting up the requirements to be what you want them to be. We work together through the software design and the architecture, and then in test, and we end up with a very different outcome. And so I hope we never do have to go back to those battle days like we had on ERAM. But like I say, of all things, to have such a vast change in the way the operations kind of needed to go with a trajectory-based system, ERAM was not a good situation to be in for us to not have had your input. You're critical to everything that we do, and every success in industry or the FAA that we have is based on your all's involvement with us. So thank you to all of you.
Can we take the second question there, Peter? Each of our airspace and systems are very unique and have different complexities, users, ANSPs, et cetera. How do we address these challenges while collaborating at the same time? Kelvin, why don't we start with you? I mean, my God, you're on the other side of the equator talking about differences and so forth. What have you seen in regard to, these are almost like local adaptations. What have you seen in this area?
Yeah, g'day everyone. Kelvin from New Zealand. We are a sovereign state to the east of Australia. We just speak very similar. I feel like a bit of a fraud up here, to be honest. We don't have a functioning collaborative relationship with our ANSP. If I was to use Brian Schul's analogy yesterday, we're in our infancy. I'm determined to get there, but we look at the likes of NAVCANADA and CATCA and to a lesser degree the Brits. And we look up to them and say that's a fantastic place to be where you've gotten to. We understand it's never perfect. You're not always going to agree on everything, but we haven't got to that stage yet. We have a relationship where the employer, the ANSP, is reluctant to include us in almost anything. I can understand that industrially or labour relations-wise, collaboration is always going to be difficult anywhere. But on a safety standpoint, with us as a union representing 365, which is probably only the size of an ACC in the States, but that's the whole of New Zealand. That's 365 SMEs that the ANSP could be using. So I can't go any further and say how do we collaborate with other ANSPs or other airspace users outside of New Zealand, because we don't have it within New Zealand yet.
Rudy, you're on CANSO, on the executive board. How do you take collaboration global? Because you heard from Kelvin, in some places it's still very much in its infancy. In the United States, where we are in Canada, it's in full swing. How do you get those complexities transmitted globally that this is a good way to do business?
Well, not easily, as everyone would know, but I think the big recognition that has to come, and I'll start with CANSO and the leadership of the 72 ANSPs that are full members, is to recognize the fact that everybody has always looked at their airspaces differently for various reasons. Some selfish reasons or just some lack of knowledge. But at the end of the day, every tower, terminal, high level, low level piece of airspace is fairly customized. So I think if the senior leadership of the air navigation service providers can recognize it doesn't have to be that way and introduce some alignment on technology, and at CANSO we just stood up a technology working group to try to design how the technology, procedures, and the air traffic controller can best use the tools in those 3 or 4 different segments, whether it be tower control, terminal, low level, high level, and get to this common way of doing business with some degree of consistency, because it'll make it much easier for not only the controllers to move around to do the work, but it will bring that harmonization for the end customer who's paying us all to do this. So I think CANSO has a place. I think each ANSP has a lot of work internally to do to reflect upon it doesn't need to be as different. In Canada, much smaller than you folks here, but not that different. We might have, I think it's 11 specialties of high level. That's about 55 sectors. Every sector's different. That'll change when the procedural element comes out of it with surveillance down to 10,000 feet of the ground. There's no reason why that surveillance that's there and deployable can't be used to bring that consistency across the board. It'll improve training, success. It'll improve the ability for controllers to move from here to there, be successful, and overall it'll bring a lot more redundancy to the air navigation service provision and consistency to what our customers on the other end of the mic are going to need to communicate about doing.
Let me look at the question that now is at the top of our list here. And Rachel, I want you to address this first, but I want to hear from some others as well. But how do we improve the interactions between our technology partners and frontline air traffic controllers to get equipment that is fit for purpose and designed with our input to make our jobs easier? Rachel, you and I were working on TAMR together. Mm-hmm. And I can't even imagine our being able to do that program without working collaboratively with NAVCANADA. Can you see ways that we could take it even further? Tell us a little bit about your experience at Raytheon, and can we take it any further?
Well, so I think you bring up the point of major modernization programs, TAMR, ERAM, ATOP, and all of these programs have benefited from when we were able to very early on talk to the users, get their input. I mean, there's a reason that industry attends events such as CFS. We get direct interaction with the users, and then we're then able to look at how we manage our own internal research and development and assure that we are aligned with what the users are going to need. And by the way, the users are not just controllers. You know, we have a broad stakeholder group, so we also need to be engaged with all of the stakeholders, whether it's airlines, the military, general aviation. And now, of course, we've got this really interesting and exciting time where we're going to have, you know, we're looking at the reality of autonomous vehicles and drones. But to your question about how to improve it, I think we're continuing to do more and more of that. But the more that we can look at collaborating even on working groups early on and looking at the strategies and the things that our government customers want to do very early enables us then to be more assertive or be prepared in advance before we come forward with some kind of an operational solution as an alternative.
Paul, can you see taking collaboration further upstream from where it is right now so that it actually begins even earlier than where it is currently?
Yeah, I think we have to. As I alluded to before, a lot of the technologies now are not national, they're international. And it's dead easy from an industrial point of view to sit here and criticize an ANSP for not engaging with us early enough. In fact, it's kind of a no-win situation for them. But we have a live issue now going on in the United Kingdom with our brothers and sisters in Ireland, which is going to completely revolutionize how we control over the ocean with satellite ADS-B, data link, and we've just got into conversations now with both the ANSPs and Force of the Irish Union. And that's an example of how we haven't got really any choice to do this. We have to, I'm a great advocate of collaboration. It's important that we get this right. Every technology that we introduce probably does, to some degree, have an industrial output. And therefore, it's not that we're against the technology, we embrace the technology, but we are and should be considered a stakeholder in how you get that technology deployed. And that technology has got to be right for our profession. So not technology for technology's sake, but to make it better.
Thank you.
So Kelvin, we heard from you that New Zealand, in its infancy, you're trying to change the way the business is being done down there. You've asked for some intervention for us to come down and talk to your counterparts about why collaboration works. Take us back 10 years in our world. What are the challenges that you're facing on a daily basis with your membership in trying to shift the culture down there?
It's an unpleasant place to be at the moment. Controllers love going to work, they love doing their job, but I would speak, it's my opinion, that the controllers in New Zealand, our members, we have a 99.9% coverage of members. They don't enjoy working for their employer. They don't enjoy working for the ANSP. They're excluded from decision making. Again, I say there's a reluctance to include us, whether that's due cost or whether they just know better. We keep trying, or I keep trying, and my team keeps trying, my executive, my council, but we don't seem to be getting very far very fast. But we are in our infancy, so those steps are going to be smaller, and I understand that. But it is encouraging to see that you guys have a collaborative relationship with your ANSP, the FAA or CATCA, NAVCANADA. And I understand you don't agree all the time either. You can't always agree. But to get to a point, there's a retired controller in New Zealand who quoted there being no there's no cover on the moral high ground. So if all parties, and it's not just ANSP, union, or a professional association, it's industry as well. If we all get together and collaborate, there are going to be some decisions that our various parties, like the board of directors or our own members, don't like. But we all have to make those decisions in a grown-up way to move forward and say, okay, this is about looking forward. It's not about protecting our ground right now. Everyone's going to have to give something up for everyone to move forward. It's like a negotiation. If you leave a negotiation and one person's crying and the other person's not, it's not a fair negotiation. So, yeah, collaboration in a safety sense in New Zealand is pretty poor as well, to be frank. We have no ATCs in our safety office which investigate safety incidents or air traffic control incidents. We've got to a point where we've told our ANSP and the safety office we've lost trust and confidence in them in that sense. So we are at rock bottom, but I'm willing to move forward with them. But they have to invite us into the tent, and at the moment we're not necessarily being invited in. We're being shown the door, but it's not being opened.
Rudy, back in 2009, when Paul and I were beginning a collaborative process, our big concern was, would whatever developed endure with change of secretary, change of administration, or whatever? What have you guys done at NAVCANADA to keep the collaborative energy fresh, to renew the trust on which collaboration is based? What do you guys do to avoid falling back to a place where Kelvin is trying to emerge from?
Well, first let me say what I've seen transpire here from my relationships with the FAA and some relationships with NATCA has been outstanding since those days you talk about. But, you know, in Canada, Peter will know, I think it was probably about 2005, we started down a similar avenue after making some early mistakes in the early days of privatization. And the model doesn't really matter. And the evidence here is proof of that, in my opinion. The model of how the organization is run, state-owned or privately owned or whatever, the long term is what needs to be the management focus. And when that long term starts to be considered, I think the trust gets generated. And you know, some people have to move first. And the trade-offs, as Kelvin referred to, are often perceived as a big deal, and they're not in the long term. So I think what we've seen at NAVCANADA, from my perspective, is we've seen a fairly good long-term view by the management as the management continues to change. Because we're all going to move on and other people are going to join. But as it takes sometimes decades to change a culture, and various leadership people will change both within the union, and they have, and both within the management, and they have. If that culture evolves with a level of trust, it becomes such a big thing to risk breaking, because it's so long to rebuild it, and so much damage is done. So we're not necessarily always going to agree on every topic, but if Peter or I sit down and think about the big picture, there's a lot of his members and our employees and our entire business at stake, and I don't believe we ever want to risk that. So consequently, I think anybody who ever joins NAVCANADA from a management perspective is going to need to have that focus, or they won't be there. My guess is that long.
Vinny, you're a long-term FAA guy, and you're not there anymore, but what advice would you give to Steve and Terry about how to keep collaboration fresh at the FAA from your perspective then and now?
Yeah, great question. You know, I think Terry's been there and holding down that fort of collaboration, no doubt. And I was mentioning it earlier, and I mean it when I say it's like walking the talk, right? If the troops see the leadership, you know, collaborate and emphasize it, then they're going to follow along. And you know, it's just making sure that people continue to understand the importance of it, the respect. You know, it's this mutual respect, and when they see it, they emulate it. They understand. I mean, everyone wants to succeed, and you know, this is clearly has been demonstrated over and over. When you collaborate, you move forward, you move the ball forward. So I think, you know, that the advice there is to keep doing what you're doing. And I think it was like the whole concept of every day is a training day. The same thing with collaboration. You don't just get it and then you're done. It requires constant renewal of the relationship and the communication with your partner and making sure that you're understanding, because the world's always changing, right? Your environment's constantly shifting. New entrants are, always, knocking on the door to come into the NAS or the international airspace, right? And you just gotta be able to stay lockstep and work through it, because you're gonna get there if you do it together. And I would suggest that is the model. I was just going to point out the second question there is a pretty important one if you wanted me to tap into that a little. And it's only because it's a good question about, so yeah, we keep talking about collaboration. What are we doing from a global perspective? And I would argue that if you think of technologies and you hear the words like SWIM, you hear the words like Datacom, you hear the words like ADSB. Well, those aren't just US-based usage of technology. Those are global usage, and those started in the early 2000s. And it was by bringing in the right people to sit down to develop the standards, and it was done at EuroK, it was done at RTCA, it was done with all the international ANSPs participating. And I will tell you that I know for a fact the FAA paid to have their NACA lead participate in the development of those standards. And what you see today with American Airlines using interval management and CAVs, which are the ADS-BN applications, those were born out of that collaboration done on an international basis. And the reason it was done that way was because the airlines don't want to buy equipment and only can use it in the United States. They want to use it everywhere. And the only way you're going to get that is, with that return on investment, is for that capability to be usable anywhere in the world. It's a long road. I mean, I'm not kidding when I said ADS-B started in the 90s, the late 90s, and here it is today, in this particular communicating for safety, everyone walks up to the booth and is telling me what ADS-B is, and I'm loving it. It's just, it's a demonstration that we finally arrived, and it's ADS-B in now, right? And, this was a battle well fought, and the rulemaking had to be coordinated with NAVCANADA, Air Services Australia, Eurocontrol, because they were the three other leading countries that were bringing in this new technology, and that was collaboration. And it wasn't really just engineers and controllers. We also had the regulators participating because we knew that was going to be the driver, right? There was an avionics shift happening, and you had to have the regulator doing the work to move the needle forward. And it's difficult running a program and a schedule when you have all these different groups of people with different motivations if you're not collaborating. So just wanted to touch on that.
And Fran, your company is selling your products to every major ANSP.
It's true.
And most of the small ones. And Rachel, same for you. What do we need? What additional structures do we need in order to move forward, as this questioner asked, in having a more collaborative approach for safety among all the international ANSPs?
Well, I think if you look at, we are taking, just so you know, some of the best pieces sort of out of our air traffic technology that we build for the US and creating a partnership around the world in various places. One of those places actually is New Zealand. So Kelvin and I had some interesting discussions over a gin and tonic collaboration about some of the issues that he was just mentioning. But although it sounds like there are issues with the industrial cooperation from what Kelvin was saying, I think we have there at least worked together, not as an organization, but with controllers in looking at those new systems and making sure they've actually helped design some of those new systems there. So I think we've learned a lot about collaboration, and not only are applying it internationally, but I think when you look at, for instance, what we're doing in the United States with Datacom today, it was interesting to watch the panel on runway incursions and the importance of keeping the pilot's head up. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what you all are trying to do as we integrate the ground-based air traffic control system with the avionics boxes with a network in between. And that Datacom was something that, having learned from those bad old days that you mentioned, David has been, from the very beginning, designed with our human factors guys working closely with controllers in our labs, actually designing that new computer-human interface that allows those routes to be uploaded. Of course, we're in a trial period right now and en route, but that is already there, keeping those heads up of pilots that are taking off out of the towers. So I think we've learned, and we are just applying those good lessons learned, and particularly we can apply them very well in the United States, where we have that good collaboration that starts from the very beginning and goes through every phase of the program, whether it's Datacom, TFDM, all difficult things. Integrating the ground with an avionics box, we're finding problems with avionics boxes that are going to take a little time to resolve. But when you're doing hard things, you need that collaboration even more.
What would you add to that, Rachel?
So I see a lot of promise in the Global Air Traffic Controllers Alliance, because that gives us, as industry, a more collective voice that we can look at as we're applying. I mean, when you look at air traffic control industry providers like Leidos and Raytheon, when you look in the air traffic domain, you know, we have what, a potential of 160 potential government customers. And so it's a very small group where we tend to be much more of a family the longer we're in the business. And I think that idea of being able to talk to a broader variety of people who, if the controllers jointly come up with safety standards, operational standards, procedures that they like, that just helps us always. And so I see a lot of involvement, and I'm hoping to see even more as this alliance proceeds forward. One thing I will tell you, and Vinny talked about the working groups, and I tried to actually count how many working groups there are internationally, and I got tired after about 50. One of the things that I see that I think we want to be involved in is, it's costly for industry to support those things. And so we have to look at, you know, where we can be involved in the best way. And how are we working, you know, when you look at all these organizations, whether it's CANSO, ICAO, RTCA, EuroCA, you know, how many of these organizations can we participate in and be involved in the meaningful way without overburdening what ultimately would become cost to our customers? So I think looking at how that overlap exists is going to be important. But I see really good progress and certainly excitement over this alliance.
So we talk about international collaboration between industry, labor, but let me bring up the number one question that's on there. It's getting an overwhelming response, and I'm gonna throw that to Paul as the president of the alliance, and picking up on some of the comments that Rachel made. Pizza's great in the tough times. But as that question says, how do we keep this camaraderie moving forward during the routine times? Talking about international collaboration from the labor, the alliance perspective.
I think there's an element of that's easy to answer, and perhaps there's a bit that's really difficult to answer. You know, we've been collaborating as unions for a long time, since we first found, well, certainly wasn't the Canadians when we found that document from an ANSP, which will remain nameless, about closing one of the ocean centres. You know, and clearly that was kind of Armageddon. That's what brought us together. Things fortunately have moved on. But you know, we've been communicating, sharing best practices, learning from each other's mistakes for the best part of 6 years, 7 years, probably longer than that. When we gave the Global Alliance a name, it was actually industry that embraced it, and some of the ANSPs that were frightened of it. So it's kind of baby steps. I'm really confident that industrially and with industry, we can continue to forge a partnership. And it is kind of day one, well, maybe day two. But, you know, our continual presence at places like the World ATM, repeating panels like this, like we did in Madrid last year, are all beneficial for the relationship for both of us, you know, both as industry and from a group of unions. But I think the more difficult bit is convincing the ANSPs of the value in us as Labour having a relationship with industry. And I think that is the biggest challenge that we will face.
Let me look at the next question at the top there. What are the biggest challenges to making international collaboration work? And Vinny and Rudy, let's talk about this in the context of space-based ADSB. Obviously, that's the Aireon business. Rudy, NAVCANADA, major investor in Aireon. Talk about what our experience with promulgating space-based ADSB among ANSPs shows us about the difficulty of collaboration among ANSPs.
Okay, I guess I'll go first, Vinny. As an operator, not as an investor of Aireon, I mean, it's about the ANSP, and it's about the tools that our controllers haven't had. That's why we exist with Aireon, to give that surveillance not only on the ocean and the polar traffic that abuts against Anchorage, but it's about that lower level. So when we went international and when Aireon started, we put a lot of effort into trying to learn from other ANSPs that were considering deploying the surveillance. But in the case of Nats and Paul's team, we put a lot of effort into ensuring we had a common system from an ATM perspective, but also common uses of those systems to how we're going to flow the traffic. That's slowly building now, and as Aireon, Vinny will talk about Aireon, but as they grow, I can only imagine that what we've been able to do between Nats and ourselves, which brings the management and the front line together for a common goal, which is better service and better safety. You know, we've had since our trials started in April, 195 alerts to a control position because the ADSB signal picks up the selected altitude change from the airplane that the oceanic controller would never have seen before. And it might have showed up in a gross navigational error depending on what happened to the airplane. So by sharing these things with not only ourselves, and I'll speak NAV and NATS, but the rest of that international community, I think is going to really contribute to giving people like the people in this room tools and the people around the world that do the same thing as the people in this room tools that continuously enhance that safety performance.
Yeah, I like the connection to safety as well, and I think that becomes a great platform for collaboration because it's a common thing that I think everyone relates to, as opposed to I just want to improve my efficiencies. Right? Safety rings the bell, and I could tell you from the Aireon perspective, you know, it's not easy standing up a company, and it was a very large-scale endeavor with many supply chain activities that finally gets you to this one delivery of this capability that now needs to be socialized within a workforce, and it's an international workforce. And I can tell you that we've learned at Aireon, because of working with our customers to define what is the concept of use, how are you going to use it, what's your purpose, and understanding that you do start to see common themes, and recognizing that Aireon has built a safety case for our surveillance up to a service delivery point. EASA has certified that capability, and that's an onerous little task that took 3 years to get your certification, and 2 months after getting it, they're already doing audits, you know, and doing continuous oversight. My point there is that certification provides an opportunity for any regulator in any country. So even if you don't have to be in the European Union, any regulator, any country in the world can pick up the phone and call EASA and ask about Aireon's performance, independent of Aireon being there. And that's important because not every ANSP is the same, and their maturity level's not equivalent. And some can whip out a safety case and talk to their regulator and activate services in a day, and some will take a year and they're scared. You know, it's a tough road. So I see the collaboration in that regard working. I see the collaboration in, we're having our first annual customer summit where we'll have all 12 of our customers invited to participate and talk about what are they learning, what are they doing with the service, and share it with each other, with all the other ANSPs in the room. And the good, bad, and the ugly, right? Because it's not perfect. And you know, how many systems do you deploy and it works perfect on day one, right? There's always things you're going to find. And from an international perspective, we are finding avionics that aren't performing. Fran mentioned that from the Datacom perspective, but we're seeing this on an international scale. And we're seeing interference issues on an international scale. It may not be in your airspace, but we're seeing it in other people's airspace. What do you do with that? Where do we bring that? Do we go to ICAO? Who's the regulator of that? These are spectrum issues. So there's a lot of interesting crossroads regarding international collaboration, and it's from all the different associations that exist and how you collaborate with them, all the different suppliers that need to collaborate, from the airlines, the pilots, the unions, the actual manufacturers, the airframe manufacturers. All of this is connected. And it seems so simple when you see a dot on the screen and you don't realize all the things that went into putting the dot on the screen and making it safe, so that the reason it should be on your screen is it was built for purpose, right? Fit for purpose was the term used in one of the other questions. And you know, you can take something and make it better, but when you design it with the user's input up front during the standards development, and then you roll it out, it doesn't just work magically the first day. So you're still troubleshooting problems, you're still debugging things, and you need the user group that was there and all the engineers and all the industry people that were participating to help solve that and get through implementation, because it's easy to put something on paper and imagine what the future is going to be. It's hard to transition to it, and you've got to figure that out. And when you have that long-term relationship and the respect for each other and the consistency in leadership, you can get there. And I'm seeing that in this evolution with Aireon and the space-based ADSB.
And can I just come in?
Yeah, please.
I think the example of the ocean and the stuff that we're experiencing now with collaboration is really key. So, you know, we said before that both the IAA and NATS have engaged with us really early. We think we know what the technology can do. No one's against the technology, but we have like 1,000 of unanswered questions about what does it mean at the end. So, you know, one operation, 2 centres, done by 1 controller. They're very high-level statements. I have no idea what they mean. You know, there's a lot of scared people out there, both in Ireland and at our Ocean Centre in Scottish. And I'm sure the world will watch. But that is a classic case where we have to collaborate. We have to understand what the impacts of that technology will be on that bit of airspace. Because as sure as eggs is eggs, if it works down there, whatever efficiencies are made, whatever savings are made, it will be a safer system. It's going to be rolled out elsewhere. So that's why it'd be interesting to come back in maybe a year's time, a couple of years' time when it's rolling, to kind of debrief it and say this worked well, this didn't work well. We did collaborate, we didn't collaborate.
Could I add to that as well? Vinny touched on safety and collaboration. I'd be surprised if there's anyone in the room, certainly not up here. I'd be disappointed actually if people didn't expect that safety collaboration is a good thing. That should be the starting point. It's an absolute no-brainer. I've talked a lot of doom and gloom about where we're at the moment. I'll even say where we were, because we have moved slightly forward in New Zealand. My plan, I'm a glass half full guy. You might not tell by the way I speak, but yeah, we want to move forward, and safety has to be the place that we start, because we're not going to get collaboration in an industrial sense first. And with that, I think industry plays a big part now, because you've now seen that the alliance is wanting to collaborate with industry, and you guys can now go direct to the unions and say, what do you think? And you can tell the ANSP or your customers that you're going to do that as well. I think it's important for you guys to draw us into the circle, because some of us don't get invited, and I'm not whining or whinging about that. It's just we should, because we are subject matter experts, because we work the boards.
Mm-hmm. So let me pick up on that for a second, Kelvin. Question number 3. No, they've moved it. It's now question number 4, but it's a 3-way tie for the second question. The question about the alliance. Is the Global Air Traffic Controllers Alliance helping to engage industry partners? And how do you see that going forward? Very easy for us to speak, but I'd like to pose that question to Fran and Rachel. How do you see the alliance? Is it working? Do you see a way to engage the end user going forward? And how do you see it working?
I think I would start by saying I think it's in the infancy, right? We, like I say, we hung out over a gin and tonic and chatted for a good long while. And I think that I see a lot of opportunities there. And let me put it into the context of the US, because I mentioned Julio as our overall rep on ERAM, and Bev, who was involved in safety, running up to the in-service decision and all of that back in the battle days, David. And as we transitioned into actually taking ERAM into the field, we needed not only Julio and Bev, but we needed that FAC rep structure as we were looking at, oh my goodness, we used to fake out this fix in this airspace because on host it was procedural and a flat plane, and now we have nationwide everything. We can't fake out this fix. If I want to get this behavior in a particular place, we're going to need to work together, and we're going to need to work together and say, I want this behavior here, and I can't throw a fix out in the ocean and pretend it's on the land and have it all work like on ERAM, because ERAM doesn't lie. It's trajectory based. So how do I do that? Going center to center as we find these places where very ingenious people over 4 decades created a set of workarounds that were definitely not in the NASMDs. We couldn't have done that without the whole structure of NATCA with the FAC rep level as we went out there and then made decisions about where is there a safety issue, what has to be fixed, what needs to be put on the list, what's the priority of fixes, the national packaging team that Vinny set up. Then not all of those collaboration groups and structures were key. And like I say, not just the 1 or 2 people who were kind of leading up the ERAM charge, but the whole facility rep, the whole structure that NACA brought to the table, and is what made such just a pretty radical change in the whole way we were doing en route airspace automation happen. So I guess that's why I would say, at least for Leidos, I think this is, a beginning, and we need to look at that. It isn't just that I mentioned earlier that there were New Zealand controllers who were part of designing this. It's not just the what on a system, it's also the how. What's the schedule is what we were talking about, So the collaboration is in a lot of different ways, needs to, we're way ahead of the game on, and we can see that in successes like Datacom right now, but there's a lot of work to be done, I think, across the board in the larger community.
So I would add to that I see one of the things that's very nice about the Alliance is when you look at, again, my point about the number of working groups that industry is either asked to participate in or would like to participate in. What the Alliance does is you have the opportunity to work out issues collectively and have ideas and recommendations of the things that you see that are going to happen going forward. How are we going to deal with drones? Not only in the United States, but in Canada or China, in Europe. And so those sorts of things, I see that the Alliance can do a lot of the upfront work collectively, because again, we are international providers of air traffic control systems. So we want to deal with ANSPs around the world. And that collective voice, so to speak, gives us an opportunity to, frankly, reduce the time of deployment and the time of development. It should hopefully underwrite or reduce the cost of systems over time. It's expensive to collaborate, right? You put people in a room or you put people on telecons, and that's tough. And sometimes it's hard to understand the benefits early on. But the benefits of not doing it in the beginning versus what it costs at the end to do that is very significant. And then, so the other thing that I see the Alliance doing is, with the theme of this conference, every day is a training day. What about global training standards? Because We talk a lot about technology as technology, but technology is not just equipment. It's how do we maintain this? How do we train controllers to use it? How do we train people to deploy, do the next instantiation? So how do we transition to the next capability and the next capability? And I see the alliance as being a really important factor there for us.
Let me ask a provocative question that may have a false premise, but I think if you were to go back 20 or so years, the FAA had a clear lead on every ANSP in terms of technology development. And I think to a certain extent, the FAA would develop something and would essentially say to everybody else, just do it this way. But we've had a democratization of innovation and insights and skill levels. How does that evolution of strong participants in the global ANSP marketplace make the demands of collaboration even heavier? Paul, you start.
I'll start with that one. I'm an easy one then.
Yeah.
I think we kind of touched on it really. You know, one of the reasons we got together was that, you know, everyone else was getting together. I'm not saying that's why we did it, because there's more to it than that. But you know, our ANSPs are talking. You're right. The different models have allowed some to be a little bit more aggressive in the marketplace. Mentioning no names. Others have commercial drivers, you know, about taking over bits of airspace or selling kit. So we've seen that collaborate and get together in groups. So I think our natural evolution was to do the same. And you know, as I don't like the phrase end users, but as end users, you know, we have that ability to try and influence industry. One of the questions before was about, I saw it before about, well, what can we actually achieve? Well, you know, I'm quite fortunate. I've been to the World ATM a few times. I've seen some great digital towers. I'm an area guy. It's dead easy to get seduced by the technology of a digital tower. But then when you see some of that kit deployed into the operation, it doesn't have the bells and whistles on, you know. And you know, I want a kit with all the bells and whistles. You know, I'm like a kid in a sweet shop. And I think part of our role is to ensure that there is an industry standard and we maintain that there is a minimum requirement for some of the technology that is deployed. And I think that's part of the role that we have to play.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Just to add to that, but how many airplanes end up in the desert with all this stuff on it that never got used? Yeah. And the challenge with, you know, all the bells and whistles is you kind of put too much in. Engineers love to design the bells and whistles, right? And that's the problem, right? And if they're not designing it with the user involved and not understanding its purpose, whether it's the pilot, controller, whomever, what happens is a lot of stuff gets put in there. And as Rachel was saying about, you know, schedule, cost, bottom line drives what gets done, right? And you don't want to waste that money because you want to attack all the cool new technologies, but you want it to be right-sized. Right, and again, you want it to be, you know, like from the safety perspective, right? How do you build in the target level of safety? And it's as, you know, you want to kind of manage the risk and make it, you know, as low as you reasonably can, right? So it becomes a little bit of a challenge of putting all the cool widgets in there, and then people don't use it, and you got to maintain that code for the life cycle of whatever that is, and it gets a little prohibitive, and you know, so it's about trying to figure out the sweet spot. And just to get back to the other question, I think the alliance is brilliant. I mean, you're not going to go forward with these new entrants, and these new entrants are not typical. We're not talking about a new automation platform. We're talking about commercial space. We're talking about people changing what's going on above us and how it's impacting us below. And I think it's a little scary at times, right? Urban mobility, drones, and I think it's contained to some degree, but then you wonder when it's not going to be contained, right? And you're not going to solve that for the U.S. or for, you know, the United Kingdom. It needs to be solved globally. Absolutely. It really needs to be figured out globally, and it needs to be thoughtfully done. Mm-hmm.
I guess I'd like to just jump in here on this alliance. And I think the biggest challenge for the alliance is clarity on some of the key priorities of the alliance. And I think some of us really resonate with the alliance and see great benefit, but some ANSPs don't or they're fearful of something else being aligned, whatever that might be, some scary thing. And I think that as you get ANSPs that change management and they're a little reluctant to be quite so open to collaboration, especially if it appears to be this alliance of of several different unions, I think the clarity of what the alliance is there to try to do will go a long way in helping ANSPs adjust with the change management. And I think that the alliance members, you folks, Paul, Kelvin, and the rest, can really leverage some of your experiences with the suppliers or the providers to the ANSPs that might not be quite so quick to be as keen on collaborating. And, you know, for example, at NAVCANADA, we used to think that we wanted to sell certain technology everywhere in the world. And we don't feel that way now. The only thing that we want to do is develop stuff that helps our business and our controllers and our staff, our flight services, et cetera. So if we can develop and we can field it in 3 countries that brings 3 different nations of air traffic controllers together to make the next iteration better, that has interest. It has nothing to do with the bottom line, and it all starts with safety. It goes back to the point Kelvin made a few minutes ago. Safety should be the focal point, and it has to be. However, it's not a perfect world. Many ANSPs are going to go out there, and that age-old slide we used to see in aviation of balancing dollars and safety still exists. Yeah. So what can we get for the best investment? And it isn't, there's a perception that many ANSPs, and maybe some do, just approach it from the economic consequences. Does it reduce shifts? Does it reduce staff? What does it cut here? Rather than how much more could we buy to give better situational awareness on the apron, taxiways for runway incursion prevention, those tools, so that somebody in a tower doesn't have to chase through 3 screens, 3 mice or mouses, or whatever we're calling them. But you know, that investment is not about anything about changing the amount of shifts you need. It's about giving those tools, and unfortunately, out of all the ANSPs in the world, not everybody approaches it that way. So I think the Alliance can help some of those other ANSPs understand the benefits if the priorities of the Alliance become very clear and not just sort of end at, well, we're just an alliance. And I think what you did in Madrid and what you're doing today is a perfect 2 steps forward towards that. I applaud you.
Yes.
Excellent. I'd like to bring up the number 1 question that's on the panel, and I'm going to pose it to Kelvin, and then I'd like the rest of the panel, who's gone through this, to throw in their comments. Collaboration is great when you have everybody involved, but what do you do in countries or jurisdictions around the world where one side is not willing to listen?
It's almost like a hospital pass, but...
Do you want me to go first and give you some thinking?
Yeah, I have given you some doom and gloom about our situation, but you can't force someone to like you. It's like any relationship. You can't make someone love you. We're not feeling the love in New Zealand, but we're moving towards, getting towards a relationship where we can work together. Yeah, I don't have a lot to say because we're in a position where I'm willing, and the team that I've put together or have elected reps, I believe they're all willing to move forward as well. You can't go any further than rock bottom, and I'm hoping we're on the bounce at the moment and heading back up. And we are using you guys as examples of the way things can be. So for us, I'm optimistic that we're going to get somewhere, but I know that it's going to take a long, long time. It took NATCA, it took CATCA, and I imagine the UK took a long time as well. And things as simple as a change in management or a couple of managers will change collaboration for good or bad. And I'm hoping that in the future we get those changes that are for good, because the people being employed in New Zealand specifically are employed in a sense that they are going to work on collaboration and work with us and we call ourselves unions, and we are a union when we're doing negotiations and contract management, but we're professional associations, and we are all professionals. Controllers are in the best profession in the world. We love our jobs and we love doing it, and there's reasons why we do that. But as I said, industry need to potentially help us and move into the collaboration with employers, but we've got to do our own part as well. And that's by maintaining an open and honest communication. And that's what we're doing at the moment. But yeah, it's going to be a long journey. And there'll be a lot of these panels between now and then. And I'm hoping that I can be like some of the others on the panel and talk a happy story. And that'll come one day.
So Rudy, we've been around a while, and we go back a long way in NAVCANADA to probably a time where Kelvin is, and we changed it. What advice do you give him about how do you change a collaborative environment in that kind of a relationship?
Well, in the absence of my colleague from New Zealand that's in the management position, I mean, I think that what my only thoughts would be is there's a lot of us doing business successfully under the interest-based approach. And it doesn't necessarily have to have the other be, because it's not always bargaining. It's this, and if you're not listening, you're not hearing the interests. And I can think of back in the time you're referring to at NAVCANADA, and a lot of people that, not only didn't listen to the union or the controllers, but they didn't listen to anyone else. And, at times, some of them move on, some of them maybe change, but sharing what those benefits of listening are from ANSP to ANSP is helpful to maybe someone in the situation that Kelvin's describing. I can tell you that, every year I've had countless exchanges with Terry and other folks from the FAA, and we learn a lot of good things from each other of what's going well in the relationship with the controllers unions, and listening to each other and listening to the respective vice presidents and members that you have, Peter. We need to gather our thoughts and say, are we on the right track? Because if we sort of test that temperature every couple of years, it can get away and it can sort of overheat on you. And at NAVCANADA, we use an intended engagement approach, which is really about trying to understand the employees' real feelings. And if we don't pay attention and listen to what those employees, including the controllers, are saying, it's going to drift away on us. So the only advice I could suggest is the organization, both the employees, the members, and the management have to have this common goal that is in the best interest of what the product is. And that product is here at CFS. It's safety. That's what we deliver. It doesn't need to be anything else. And I can appreciate in some countries, things drift for political expedience and other reasons. But it all comes back to what everybody's doing with a microphone or a datacom link every day.
Both sides got to want to change, haven't they? And that's the start. That's the catalyst. How you get there. Well, there's lots of help out there actually. So, for a commission, I'll help you. But we spend a lot of time. I mean, Europe's a pretty messed up place. They're multi-union in a lot of the countries. So getting a collaborative approach in Europe's quite difficult. And I can speak as a European. Well, for at least another month, I guess. But CANSO and European Transport Workers Federation have developed a social dialogue toolbox, which is it's a process. It's there's workshops that you can do, and there are stages that help you go through kind of industrial hand-holding to get a win-win situation. It's not perfect. Both sides have got to want to do it and engage. And the toolbox is what it is. If you've only got a hammer in a toolbox, you're going to use it as a nail, aren't you? If you've got a range of other tools, then you're going to get to some sort of collaboration eventually. But in Europe, it's a problem. Multi-union countries are difficult to get them talking as one anyway, let alone with their managers. But there is quite a bit out there, and that's, again, something else that the Alliance can do in terms of sharing experience.
If you look at the third question there's obviously a large appetite for more of the how-to on collaboration. And, Vinny and Fran, I mean, I think you can honestly say that collaboration took a big step forward at the FAA because we were having a crisis. I mean, we had programs that were on the verge of collapse, and collaboration became our tool for bringing them back to life. Do you have to have a crisis to start collaborating? How do you do it? How do you do it without a crisis driving you to it?
You know, it's interesting because I was reading something earlier also about the pizza comment, right?
Yes.
And I think it's funny because I don't know. It seems like every day feels like there's a crisis going on. I mean, I don't know what norm is, right? I don't think in the aviation industry, I don't know what that is. When is there a calm day? When do you come in and everything worked out perfectly and you go home early? And what's interesting is with the concept of collaboration, and I just want to go back to the gin and tonic and the pizza, right? One of the tools that I recall really vividly was we went to dinner. We broke bread with Paul, right? And you know, you don't do that lightly, right? That's really where you can honestly talk to each other and understand. And that's where the guard comes down and people just start to communicate. And I just think it's funny because, you know, the drink or the pizza, whatever it is one of the tools in the toolbox that should be considered because you need to start treating each other like normal people, right? And let the pretenses go away. And everyone wants to succeed. I said that earlier, and it comes back to, you know, where are we going? Do you need to have the crisis? No, if you don't do it every day, you're going to have a crisis, right? So it's preventing the crisis. It's insurance. It's making sure, right? And it's you train every day, right? And you don't expect the bad thing to happen, but when it happens, you know how to handle it. Well, when you collaborate every day, you're preventing the massive failure from occurring, right? And I think, you know, I think that's the mindset that people should embrace. And once you get into the rhythm, I think it's actually easier than waiting for the crisis and have to figure out how to collaborate. Right? It's a practiced art, and I really believe that you can't afford not to do it.
And Paul's taste in Cabernets are very expensive. What else, Fran?
Well, I think that what Vinny said is absolutely correct, and I think sitting in as a member of industry, wanting to get a system to the next step, and I think it needs all three. It needs the FAA, it needs NATCA, and it needs industry at the table. And until that happens, if it hasn't been happening, then I don't think we really, two of the three we're not going to get there. And it isn't something that one of the three can initiate all by themselves and make happen all by themselves. So I think we had the advantage, you know, David, of you and Vinny and industry and NATCA, and we were able to bootstrap, you know, kind of that as we got that, you know, coming out of the drought, I will call it, or the battle days. But I think that, you know, it has to be all three, I think. And I like what Vinny said, and we all have to view each other's perspectives as valuable, and whether it's over dinner or drinks or whatever, we need to truly listen and then set up the structures, because in industry, can't set up a structure where I'm working with all those people independent of the FAA, and that's why I say there's definitely a big role for industry, but you know, it really needed to be you, David, and I give you a tremendous amount of credit there. We were talking in the prep about the ways in which we were all working together, and Vinny, all hours of the day or night, when something would happen, we'd be all talking, and then ultimately, you know, with Julio, and as that whole structure got put in place. But it all needs to come together. One party, just like Kelvin said, can't make it happen any more than you can make somebody like you. I know I like that illustration.
Just one other point, because I think someone was goofing around, like how many frequent flyer miles do any Article 114 member have? Or how many nights have you spent in a hotel? And the reason I bring that up is when you're collaborating, there's a willingness to do more than your 40-hour a week, right? Julio only had to work, what was it, 2 days a week to reboot ERAM? You know, when you think about that, he did not, right? And you put a lot, you sacrifice a lot.
Yes.
You sacrifice your family, you sacrifice your health, And you do it because your professionalism and it's in your DNA, right? This is why you're here. And people are doing 70 hours a week and not even blinking. Yeah. And then there comes a time where they say, basta, I had enough. And that's fair because they got it over the line. And most people don't quit till they get it over the line. And you get that through the collaborative relationship. You're not going to get it with the antagonistic, let's fight over every single thing we're trying to do. So.
All right, we're just about out of time. I'd like to thank the panel members and make a couple of comments about the leadership in NAVCANADA. This is a change, and David, what you did in the FAA as well. It's a change, collaboration, and it's a lot of us as union people struggle with this. We struggle with the dinners, like, oh, that's all you do, you go out for dinner, you have your gin and your tonics, and we're changing the way we do business. And my hat goes off to David and Terry and Paul and Trish and what they've done. The benefits are so evident. And I applaud everybody, and just this panel in itself, to have industry and labor and management all together talking is a wonderful thing. And it's the way that we have to do business, I think.
It is the way we have to do it. And if you want to get stuff done, you collaborate. And you frequently find when you collaborate, you really like your collaborators.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, folks.
Cheers, buddy. Well done.